Partigiano, portami via!
Oh bella ciao, 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 ciao!
Partigiano, portami via! Perché mi sento di morire.
So what I wanted to do was go through what Marx said about economics, which is complicated by two things. One of them is that Marx rather selfishly died before finishing his work in economics, which is the first problem. The second problem is that this has given ample opportunity for every single Marxist economist since to argue about what Marx really meant and to interpret everything in different ways, almost like the quote that he has, you know, the point is to interpret things in their different ways and then forget that you have to change anything at the end of it, which leads on to a third problem, in numeracy being an issue in economics more generally, which is of course that what I'm going to present to you is kind of an interpretation of what Marx said. In particular, it's my kind of interpretation of what Marx said, and you'll find other people disagree with this or that part of it. But this is a guide to Marx's economics, and therefore I will try and follow his own method in doing this, which is in a couple of things, which is starting where he started, which is an abstract description of the economy, because I think you have to start from there. The economy is like a big, complicated thing. And you can wander around wondering what on earth's going on, and most of us do, all of us do, I do myself, really quite a lot of the time. And that unless you've got some way of cracking into that and prizing out the most important features of the thing, none of it makes any sense. So what I'm going to try and do is go through, step by step, Marx's system, his systematic way of understanding how the economy operates. I'm going to start with, I've got some slightly unpleasant photographs. This is a picture of a finance minister from a heavily indebted European country where tax evasion and corruption are rife, where the population has suffered the last 4 or 5 years of the worst austerity cuts for generations. Standing next to him is Yanis Varoufakis, who's a Greek finance minister. He's always trying. I was told to always get a joke in first. I remember some lecturer saying this. It kind of butters the audience up, so they're happy up to that point. So Yanis Varoufakis, who does claim to be a Marxist, he says he's got quite an interesting essay, Confessions of an Erratic Marxist. Says something interesting about why study economics at all. Well, it's so economists don't delude you, right? So you don't get fooled by what economists are trying to say, which is really quite a useful skill because they pop up all over the place and they're accorded this incredible authority. So the other thing I want to do as we're going along is do what Marx did, which is if you get his big work, his magnum opus, unfinished, Engels had to kind of piece the last bits of it together after he died. The subtitle of Marx's Capital is A Critique of Political Economy. So it's not just, there you go, here's my thoughts about the economy. He's saying the way to understand the economy is to take what other people are saying about it and critique it and turn that around and pull out the truth. Because the difficulty when you're dealing with the economy and with society, and with all the things that Marx was bothered about, is exactly what the previous session on philosophy was covering, which is this issue of alienation, which is this issue of power and ideology and the way that things get mystified and you can't really see things. And Marx's way through that was to try and pull out what was wrong with what other people said about the economy. So I'm going to kind of start with that. Most places teach you the most awful kind of ideological mishmash of bad maths, bad boring maths, and apologetics for the free market. I've kept the maths to an absolute bare minimum in this, you'll be pleased to hear. So let's start with the abstract, right? So if you're going to think about the economy, what is the most obvious? If you're going to say, what is just like the absolutely obvious screaming thing about the economy we live in? Money. You start with money, and Marx starts with money. If you look in the first chapter, the first volume of Capital, he starts with money. And he starts with money because if you start with money, you can unpack what's going on in the rest of the economy. It starts to give you a sense of what's going on there. So, money. It's everywhere. It covers everything. If you have money, and you have a world in which everything is for sale and everything is dominated by money, then you have a world that looks very much like our one. So we start with money. Here is money. It has some very particular properties. This is the closest we get to any kind of maths. This is Marx's description of something that happens under capitalism. If you have money, what is the thing you can do with money? Buy stuff. I hope you're going to say buy things with it. So you can buy things with it. You can buy, in particular, commodities. So you can buy something that has lots of desirable properties in itself. Things that you would want that, or desire that, or need that object for. But you can stick a price tag on it and use money to buy it. So it becomes a commodity. And this is Marx's description of basically all of capitalism operates like this. And they, not stretching things too much, but if you can grasp this, and I'm going to come back to it right at the end, maybe halfway through. If you can grasp what this description is about, you can basically get more or less all of Marx was talking about, and therefore all of how the world of capitalism that we live in operates. And what Marx is saying here is that the fundamental process in capitalism is one in which there is a stock of money, it is changed and exchanged for commodities, and then by some mysterious process out the other side you get more money out the other end. You can reduce that a little bit, and I'll come on to why this matters. You start with money, you get more money. This is the mysterious thing about capitalism. You start with money, you get more money. And the question to pose yourselves is how and why that might happen. So there's two things. Money. In Marx's description of universal commodity, we live in a system of, he says, generalised commodity productions, commodities. That's everything you can buy with the money. So there's two elements. And this is how the economy starts to function. Things. Things on one side, money on the other. Commodity is a thing, but it's a thing of a particular kind. That it has on one side, it has the desirable characteristics of that commodity. And commodity can be anything. If you can sell it, if you can put a price on it, you don't even have to sell the stuff. If you can put a price on it, it's a commodity. And it has a use value, which is its inherent properties. And this depends on whatever it is. It might be, I'm looking in front of me, it could be a bottle of water, it could be a cup of coffee, it could be absolutely anything. The use value of the thing is what you get out of it. That is what makes it the thing that you want or need. And it has an exchange value, which is a particular relationship this commodity has with every other commodity. It's the rate at which it exchanges for other commodities. It's not quite it is kind of like a price, but at this point we're not really talking about introducing money as yet, because you're saying that perhaps that bottle of water is worth twice as much, this can't be right, as the cup of coffee next to it. This is almost certainly not what's going to happen. It's the other way around. Cup of coffee twice as much as the bottle of water. That's their exchange value. It's a relationship between those two things. So what's the process of exchange? Now, if you have done sort of conventional economics, this will start to become familiar about now. But Marx says we live in a world of generalised commodities. People buy and sell things. They have a process of exchange, which you can look at it the other way around. You have commodities, which you sell for money, then you go off and buy other different commodities. So I'm a bottle of water selling person, and I sell bottles of water. I kind of wish there was something more interesting in front of me to use as an example, but I'm selling bottles of water, and I get money for those, and then using that money I can go off and buy other different commodities. I've got more than enough water myself, I don't want more bottles of water, that's why I'm selling this stuff, so then I can go off and buy other things. And you can look at the world this way round. You can look at it as this process of, well, we sell things, right? Everybody's selling stuff, they get the money, and then, of course, they go off and buy more things. Of course, what you can do here is something quite interesting. Interesting, but ultimately pointless, but nevertheless we'll go through it, which is say that, look, what's really going on is money doesn't matter very much here. What's really going on is you're swapping one commodity for another commodity. I don't really want the money, I just have to use the money. And if you've done conventional economics, if you've studied this at any point, this is basically what they'll teach you. They'll teach you neoclassical economics, which is all about saying exchange is everything. The world we live in fact functions on the basis of exchanging different commodities, and that therefore money doesn't really matter. We can ignore money. Now, you might spot an obvious flaw with this way of thinking about the world. The obvious one being that it's quite hard to, you can try ignoring money. You can get away with this for a certain amount of time. I've put it to you as an experiment that you probably wouldn't last more than, frankly in London you won't last more than a few hours if you try seriously ignoring money. It's a very, very hard thing to do. It's there all the time. But there's something more fundamental that's wrong here. That if you're conventional, neoclassical, like the economics they teach at most universities, almost every university, like the economics you get at A level, like the stuff that underlies what they say on the news, they're kind of trying to talk about a world in which money doesn't really matter very much. It's all about just objects, just casually exchanging. We don't need to think about money, it doesn't matter. And this is all quite a harmonious world. If all we're doing is going around swapping things that we have and for things that we want, the world can be quite harmonious. There should be no crises, there should be no problems of any sort. No one should really complain, nothing should ever really happen. We just merrily exchange things. This is the essence of capitalism, say its apologists. The difficulty you've got, of course, is that once you introduce money, you're actually going through two separate processes here. That if you have things to sell, so bottles of water, cups of coffee, what else have I seen, iPhones, whatever it might be, yeah? However you've obtained them, you have things to sell, you're offering them for sale. You expect to get money back. If you then want to go off and buy something different, you have to use that money to buy something different. Now, the difficulty here is that the act of offering something for sale and the act of buying something are different once you have money. That I can offer something for sale, no one has to buy it, right? I offer it for sale for money, I expect to get money, there's completely optional whether anyone actually does this. And because it's completely optional whether anyone actually does this, as Marx points out very, very early on, in theories of surplus value, there's a possibility here of things breaking down. That your world in which you said exchange is the most important thing, this defines capitalism, Adam Smith says this, Ricardo more or less says this, all the early economists say this, neoclassical economics basically says that now, we're just exchanging stuff, that's what's going on, nothing to see here. Once you actually have to use money to do this, you build in the possibility of crisis, because it's not necessarily the case that you're able necessarily to sell the thing that you're offering for sale. And as soon as you get that there is the possibility that things go wrong. You just have goods that are unsold. You misjudge in one way or another. It's a possibility of crisis. You get a bit more into it, and this word gets bandied about anyway, but this is often referred to as Keynesian economics. Recognition of this fact, that not everything offered for sale is bought. That in practice, what you can have is a world in which lots of things are offered for sale, and then for whatever reason, people aren't buying them. And this is where you get the idea that's critical to Keynesian economics, that the government can step in and make all of this work. The government can step in and make all of this work, for instance, by saying, well, we will spend the money if other people aren't spending it. And if we spend the money, all those unsold goods will be bought, and the economy will tick over quite happily. You end up in this kind of Keynesian world, this description of the economy with Keynesianism, kind of Keynesianism you get taught here and lots of other universities, kind of Keynesianism that people like Paul Krugman or Joseph Stiglitz or various other luminaries think about, is a world in which you have households and firms, and they kind of buy and sell things from each other. Households sell their labour, the firms produce an output, and the households buy things from firms, and then the firms give money to households because they work, and then the other way around, and labour goes to the firms, and then the firms sell their output back to the households, and everything kind of balances out quite smoothly, apart from these occasional disruptions where the government has to step in and pump a bit more money into the system. Now, so this is Keynesianism. This is actually quite close to what's happening. It is critical, and we'll come on to what Marx said about this, it's critical that if you offer something for sale, if you produce something for sale, you have to have someone buys the stuff. So you have to have households giving their households here have got money from firms for their work, and they then buy stuff from the firms. This is the output, goes back to the household, and it goes round and round and round. It's actually still quite a smooth functioning system, with the kink that every so often, and Keynes has a lot of writing on this, every so often the circuit of money breaks down and the government has to step in, one way or the other. That's the Keynesian system. There is, I think, a small problem with this. In fact, I'm very glad you can read that, otherwise the joke would be wasted. There's a small problem with this, which is actually quite a large problem, which is, why does this make some people rich? If we're all just passing money around, and everybody's quite happy, and there's a market for labour, and some people have firms, why is it that systematically, over time, some people get rich? This should not happen. You have a nice little circle, everything's going round and round and round. And in fact, what's happening is that some people are somehow or other, by some process, getting richer and richer out of that. We're back to this, I'm afraid. I'll just do a little, there's 2 slides that try and go around some of this one. Why is it, in other words, that we have a process where some people have money, they then kind of buy and sell things, and at the end of this, they get more money? Why is it that the money can expand over time? Why is it that some people get that money and other people do not get that money? It's kind of the key question here. Now, if we start to think about, well, how would you start with one lump of money and get more money if you have to try and sell something? You have to have a commodity which you offer for sale, somebody else buys. How do you get that to be more money? The thing you might want to do is turn that commodity into another one. In fact, you will want to do that. Very early capitalism. Marx takes a historical materialist method in the sense that his theory, although abstract, ties itself back to real developments under capitalism. Very early capitalism works on a fairly literal-minded version of this. That if you are buying spices from India, one way to change that spice in India is to turn it to a spice in Venice. You've changed that commodity in the sense it's now somewhere else. And somebody else will pay you more money for having that spice in Venice than you had to buy it in India. You can arrange trade like this. And this is how capitalism develops, on the basis of trade, on the basis of exchange, over a long distance. Early capitalists grow up inside basically feudal societies precisely around this kind of mechanism. So you can make a certain amount of money like that. The difficulty you run into is that this isn't systematic. We live in a system where some people continually get richer. So you have to try and explain how it's possible systematically that to occur. And this is where Marx does something interesting. And this is kind of the heart of the matter. That this process of turning commodities into other commodities, this process of using your money to buy commodities and then selling the commodities and getting more money, you can insert something in the middle here. And you can do so systematically, which will always, you hope, get you more money out the other side. And this is the essence of capitalism. This is the secret of production, EFP. That you can take commodities, you transform them through a process of production into different commodities, and then you sell the stuff for more money out the other end. And you can do this not on the basis of just trading over long distances, but you can do it right at the heart of the system. You can make it something that's fundamental, and is fundamental to how the system works. And this is the key to it. This is basically a labour theory of value. If you ever mention, should you ever go to like conventional economics course or lecture or whatever and talk about labour theory of value, they'll throw you out the room or laugh at you or something like this. They try and deny that it matters. The reason they try and deny that it matters is there's actually a very, very powerful idea behind this, which is precisely that issue. That it's how we can operate in the world, how we change the world, that defines us as people, and yet this power under capitalism is taken and turned into something else. But we can work, we can labour. It's this thing that can turn commodities from one sort of thing into another sort of thing. You can take tyres, engine parts, a chassis, whatever else you need to build a car. Frankly, I don't really know, but that seems to be the essentials. You take all that, you get people working on it, it becomes a fully finished car at the end, you sell it, you make more money. Labour matters here. Just a caveat, of course, labour and nature. Somebody mentioned the critique of the Gotha programme earlier. So Marx sometimes gets, I think very incorrectly, although experience the Soviet Union, that sort of thing, Marx sometimes gets a little bit mislabelled as someone who only thinks labour is the source of all wealth. Marx very, very clearly and explicitly says labour is not the source of all wealth. The source of all wealth is labour plus nature. There's a whole natural world out there that can also act as a form of wealth. Very obviously, I mean, I'll come on to oil and things in a bit, but very obviously you can turn nature, treat it as a source of wealth, put it with labour, transform things, make the world different. This is wealth, this is value. This is I thought you might need a picture of some nature. It's kind of soothing reminder around about this. This is some nature. This too has a value alongside labour. And it's the capacity of labour to work on nature and with the products of labour that gives it a particular use. Labour has a use value. Note that I'm saying use value here, because we're inching towards something important, which is that everything's a commodity, including, of course, labour. People sell their labour. You go to work for money. You're turning your labour into a commodity. Labour has use value, and its use value is it transforms wealth, transforms value, changes things, alters stuff, can make things different. And because it can make things different, it has a use value. So labour is bought by capitalists. Remember, we're dealing with sort of an abstract model here, right? There's lots and lots of other complicated things, but what we're trying to do is get down to the bare bones of the system. Labour, capital. Workers here, capitalists there. In reality, as we discussed earlier, lots and lots of other different things can happen, but the bare bones of the system, the heart of it, look like this. So labour is bought by capitalists. In other words, that labour, that work is commodified. You're turning your capacity to work into a commodity itself. This is alienation. Your capacity to work is taken away from you. It's taken away from you by someone else. It's taken away, you are there to work, but you're not there to express yourself as a human being, to be any of these other things you might be. You're there to work in a particular way, for particular purposes that you do not set. Somebody else sets these for you. That's what it means to turn your labour into a commodity. It's Henry Ford, who was a horrible man, horrible racist man, but defined much of the modern world. He said, how come every time I want a pair of hands, I get a human being? Right? This is the dilemma, for a capitalist point of view at least, is that you need the work and all these bloody people come attached to it. Labour power produces commodities. In a world of commodity production, why are you employed? You produce other commodities. That's what you're doing. So over time, you're just producing more and more stuff, things that can be sold, so the capitalists can make money. There is a hierarchy in the labour market, as touched on. It pre-exists capitalism. It's kind of there already, but the introduction of capitalism reinforces this. That some people own stuff, other people have to work. That's a fundamental hierarchy. If you want to know a definition of working class or being a worker, do they have to depend on their labour to survive, selling their labour to survive? If the answer is basically yes, then basically they're working class, at least in this kind of abstract sense. There's other complications that can creep in, I think, onto them. But there is a basic hierarchy in the labour market, and labour power, your capacity to work, is alienated. It's taken away from you because you sell your labour. So, labour power produces commodities. These commodities, like every commodity, themselves have a use value. That's the thing that people want in the commodity. There's an exchange value. That's how much the commodity is worth relative to everything else. If you're changing the commodities, you're producing new exchange values. The commodities you're producing will exchange at a different rate to everything else. In other words, you're kind of producing new wealth here. And in particular, you yourself are a commodity, but you're paid a different exchange value to the exchange values you're producing. You'll be a very bad capitalist if you take that paying a different exchange value as saying, hey, let's just pay them more than the exchange value they're producing. The key to this is, of course, you pay them less. This is a disguised transaction, because when you go out to work, you get all of this in money. You don't see the outcome of your work. You just have somebody else who's selling it. You don't see this taking place. But you're producing new commodities. These commodities are then sold by someone else at a different value to what they paid you for your capacity to work. And that is the fundamental way in which you make profits. But key to this, look, this is exploitation. This is somebody else alienating your labour, telling you what to do, using their power in the labour market. They own the wealth, they own the assets, they own the capital, you do not. And because of this, they can pay you less than the value of what you produce. And out of that, they make profit, or in Marx's term, surplus value. They make additional sums for themselves. So capitalists exploit labour. This is inherent. To be clear on this, when we say exploitation, certainly when Marx says exploitation, we often think about exploitation is like if you are working on 50p a day in making night trainers in Indonesia or the Philippines, well, yeah, that's exploitation. And then you think, well, if you're quite a well-paid car worker in Britain, there's quite a few still left, you're quite well paid, and you think that's not exploited, it's not too great, it's not exploited. Marx says something different. This isn't really a moral category we're talking about here. Maybe degrees of exploitation, maybe degrees of unpleasantness, and oppression and general horror involved in it. But if you're working for a capitalist, you are exploited. That is why you are employed, because you're producing surplus value. So exploitation is completely generalised. Everybody gets this. Everybody is alienated in this way. Discipline, of course, is enforced through unemployment. You threaten people with unemployment. You threaten people with this reserve army of labour, which helps stop people, because they can get a sense of this, insisting and taking some of that surplus value back for themselves. Unemployment acts as a disciplining device inside the labour market. And surplus value, finally, is what the capitalist wants to get hold of. It's the other, third key element here. The capitalist has to accumulate. They have to accumulate because capitalism doesn't exist, or capital, the ruling class, doesn't exist as a single lump that has one line of command, that does one thing, that tells you what to do. It exists as multiple competing capitals, or less complexly, firms. There are many, many firms that compete with each other. Because there are many, many firms that compete with each other, and are geared up entirely in this system to produce surplus value over time, and if they don't produce a sufficient rate of surplus value, they go bankrupt, they go out of business. Everything is geared to drive as hard as possible to maximise the amount of surplus value you're making, the amount of profit you're making all the time. This is competition at the heart of how capitalism operates. It is a competitive system. So there's a hierarchy at work. Capitalists have capital, have the wealth. They employ labour to exploit it. The capitalists themselves are then divided amongst themselves. And this division forces a frantic pace of competition. The competition is what forces them to keep on exploiting you. You might be a nice capitalist, right? You might be, and you might think that's all lovely and wonderful. Competition is what forces you to behave exactly as badly, literally exactly as badly as every other capitalist out there. You have to do this. So in a certain sense, and despite all the hoo-ha I told you there were some fairly unpleasant photographs popping up. Despite all the hoo-ha, and this is pure ideology, despite all the fuss you get about entrepreneurs, they're creative, they're wonderful, they get out there and make new possibilities for us. What Marx would say, well, I agree with him entirely, is this is complete nonsense. That all of these people, entrepreneurs, people making money, people attempting to make money, all of these people are no longer behaving like people. They are, in Marx's phrase, functionaries of capital, including, of course, Richard Branson, who I take as a sort of uber example of this kind of thing. They're not behaving like people anymore. So the kind of ideological nonsense, entrepreneurship is everything, we must all be entrepreneurs, they are creative, they are wonderful people who get out there and transform the world for us. I mean, Joseph Schumpeter, a very good economist, he was kind of an anti-Marx, put this idea at the centre of his own economic theory. Entrepreneurs change everything, they make the world different. What Marx says is no, it's the process of accumulation, the process of alienation, these terrible social structures that force everyone to behave in a certain way. If we get any innovation, if we get new products out the other side, that is a byproduct of the fundamental process of exploitation and competitive accumulation. So in other words, capitalists don't behave like people. It doesn't matter whether they want to be nice or not nice, or they're creative or clever or whatever. Once they're locked into the system, they're all functionaries of capital. They can only behave in one way if they're a capitalist at all. So, as Marx says, accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets. In other words, this is everything. This is the law. This is the thing you do. You must accumulate. You're driven to do this. Competition compels you to carry on doing that. It's also an excuse to sneak in this slightly ropey pun, which is that profits lie at the heart of this. And the generation of profits and the division of profits is what capitalists get very upset and squabble with each other about most. And profit is the monetary expression of this process. It's what you want to get to once you've exploited your labour, sold the products, got the additional surplus value, you sell the stuff, you claim the profit. Where does that get us? Well, firstly, capital. What do you do with your accumulation of labour? You do something in particular, which is that you turn it into capital. You go off, exploit some workers, they generate a load of surplus value for it, you get that as profits in money form. You then take your money, you may well spend a lot of this on, God knows, Bugattis or Rolex watches or whatever else you like. Some of it is just your luxury consumption, as the capitalist class, they spend their money on these things. If anybody sees, it's a wonderful and horrible website, Rich Kids of Instagram. If you want to have a look at the sort of, Marx calls this Department 3, this is luxury consumption by the capitalists. Basically it's irrelevant economically, but you know, it's sort of flim-flam. What you really want to do if you're driving the process of accumulation is invest in new machinery, capital, new equipment. Why do you do that? Because that gives you the edge on everybody else. You can exploit your workers better than other people if you have new machinery. You can produce cars faster, cheaper. You can do all of these things. This machinery, Marx calls dead labour. It's an expression, again, of this alienation. There is a wonderful capacity we all have to change the world, to be more productive, to transform what happens. Because we live under capitalism, it's used against us. This dead labour fights against us, and it's what helps generate more surplus value for the capitalists. You may spot a problem here, which is that if labour is what's producing profits over time, surplus value, if surplus value is what's driving the thing on, but if capitalists are forced to introduce new machinery, new equipment, to try and get the edge on each other, over time they're investing more and more and more in machinery, they're not investing so much in labour. But if labour is a source of profits, over time, and Marx indicates this, and some people get very het up about it, Marx indicates that there must be a tendency for the amount of profit they're producing over time to decline. A tendency over time for the rate of profit to fall. Because their drive to accumulate capital, dead labour, squeezes out living labour, which is the part that actually produces surplus value. And it's competition that forces them into this. And if everyone can sit back and go, let's not compete, if you come to some mad worldwide cartel of all the capitalists in the world who said, you know what, let's just stop accumulating and spend all of it on Bugattis and Rolexes and the rest, then that would, in theory, get rid of this falling rate of profits and all the other problems that you have there, in theory. In practice, of course, they'd still be competitive and someone would decide, sod this, I'm going off to invest in new machinery, and the whole thing would collapse. Capitalism has to exist as multiple competing units of capital, multiple firms. So, theory of tendency of rate of profit to fall. What it says is if it's the rate of profit that's kind of your underlying motor, you need profits. If you're getting less profits per amount invested over time, then what you've got here is a theory built into Marx of how capitalism slows down over time. quick and easy representation of this. This is, I think, the only graph in the entire presentation. Average GDP growth, GDP, size of the economy, conventionally measured per decade, from 1950s through to 2010s. Peaks in the 1960s, every single decade since then, growth in Britain slows down. The rate of accumulation slows down. The rate of profit is actually falling over this time as well, but this is the more conventional measure for it. Capitalism is getting older and slower. It's like a human being in that sense. It's getting less good at producing profit. It's less good at avoiding crises. This is what this is telling you. You can reproduce this graph for pretty much any developed economy. If you go to somewhere like China, it runs the opposite way, and then only recently has it started to curl off, because it's a newer capital. It's a newer unit of capital. So that's average growth by decade. What are the conclusions, or some of the conclusions from this? And I might come on to the final set of slides, how you apply it, perhaps at the end of the questions. There's a couple of things here. You get out of this the concentration and centralisation of capital. This competitive system, it is always driven to accumulate more and more. Each individual capitalist is forced into this. All the institutions you see, the stock market, the financial system generally, force this on them. Bankruptcy laws, your shareholders, everything drives you towards this. As you accumulate and accumulate, you get bigger and bigger. That means all the capitalists are getting bigger and bigger. And when one of them goes bankrupt, the others grab. And they get bigger and bigger. So you get this concentration of capital, and you get centralisation of capital. These two things come together. So capitalism gets bigger. You have a state, front piece from Hobbes' Leviathan. You have the state, which starts to, as a part of this process of concentration and centralisation, becomes more and more important. It's a big ideological thing. Oh, we don't need the state. The state's not there anymore. Roll back the frontiers of the state, says Margaret Thatcher. This is neo-liberalism. It's kind of rubbish. Fairly clearly, neo-liberalism needs a state. You know, we've all gone through 2008 when the state, at vast expense, had to bail out the financial system. So the state gets more and more important as units of capital get bigger. As the competition still exists, you need ways to regulate that competition. You start to get to the point, actually, where big units of national capital start to use their state to elbow other units of national capital out of the way. Big units of capital start to influence and shape how their state operates. So states start to compete as well. So all of this turns into a process of competition. You get finance, the appearance of finance. As the size of capitalism's operations grow, it gets beyond the point any individual capitalist can finance it. You need a system of pooling the wealth of capitalists so they can invest, so they can carry on competitively accumulating. They can carry on doing this. That's finance. That's the role of finance, is basically to act as a big pot that all the capitalists can put their wealth into, and out of that they can look for opportunities to invest and therefore carry on accumulating. What this means, by the way, of course, is that finance is parasitic on the whole process. Finance is not itself making money. But whatever you might think about the people down the road from here, in the various buildings in the City of London and Canary Wharf, at least at the top of these institutions, they are not producing wealth, they are parasites on the production of wealth. But they are, in a sense, necessary parasites because of this problem of scale of capitalism needing to mobilise very, very large units of capital to carry on competing. And of course, the final bit, and I'll finish here, and then open for questions. The final bit, of course, is you get crisis. Now, Marx, partly because he died before really wrapping everything up, I think it's fair to say had several different theories of crisis. At multiple points in this whole thing, you can run into problems. We're already seeing that if you don't sell something, you produce, but then you don't sell, that's a crisis. This is what you call a realisation crisis. You have to sell stuff to get the profits. You have to sell it. The profit's kind of locked up. The surplus value is locked up in the commodities you produce. Unless you sell them, you don't realise it. In Marx's expression, you have to sell the stuff. So you can have a problem that, in Keynes' description, there's not enough spending. There's not enough spending, there's not enough money, so you get a crisis then. You can get a crisis of competition. Competition, very directly, can lead to overproduction. You get mad enthusiasms for different kinds of production. You've seen this most recently with oil, where the price has gone up and up and up. Capital has piled into it in a huge way. If you look at shale oil production in the US, big new thing you can do, new technology, getting oil in new exciting ways, very, very heavily dependent on finance, on borrowing. Unusually dependent on borrowing to make that happen, so it's very, very speculative. They pile into it, expecting to make loads of money out of the price of oil. The price of oil drops. All of this suddenly looks very shaky. So you can have a crisis emerging like that. And you can get a crisis of profitability, which in the crudest sense, something like this may have happened in the 70s, which is, of course, the crisis that you get when there is this squeeze being placed on capital and its ability to make profits because labour is being asserted. So you can start to generate a crisis out of that. Finally, of course, most importantly for us at the minute, is a pure financial crisis. The financial system is a completely mad, fictitious world of people competing with money alone, with no reference necessarily to production. Because it's parasitic, because it doesn't have to engage itself in production, it can invent its own rules. By inventing its own rules, it can very rapidly trip over itself. As the scale of the thing increases, that potential to trip over itself gets worse and worse. When you have a very large financial system like we have here, it's very, very detached from production in the rest of the economy. Its capacity to trip over itself and force that cost on everybody else gets very, very high. I'm going to wrap up on that point because Daisy says so.
Una mattina mi sto svegliato.
Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao.
Una mattina mi sto svegliato e ho trovato l'invasore. Oh partigiano, portami via.
Oh bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao.
Partigiano, portami via, perché mi sento